Messi's tip saves a waitress from being evicted. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. In the heart of a bustling city, nestled between towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, sat a small, unassuming cafe. The faded sign above the entrance read Ramirez's Cafe, a name that held little significance to the passers-by who hurried along the sidewalk, their minds preoccupied with their own troubles and aspirations. Inside the cafe, Lucia, a young waitress with dark, tired eyes and a smile that never quite reached them, moved between the tables with a practiced efficiency. She had been working at Ramirez's Cafe for 3 years now, ever since she had arrived in the city with nothing but a small suitcase and a heart full of dreams. But dreams, she had quickly learned, were a luxury she could not afford. The city was expensive, and her meager wages barely covered her rent and basic necessities. She had no family to turn to, no friends to lean on. She was alone in this unforgiving metropolis, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. As she wiped down a table, her mind drifted to the letter she had received from her landlord that morning. The words had been cold and uncompromising, a stark reminder of the precariousness of her situation. She had until the end of the week to pay her overdue rent, or she would be evicted. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had nowhere else to go, no safety net to catch her if she fell. Lucia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the cafe door opening. She looked up to see a man enter, his face obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. He walked with a slight limp, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to make himself invisible. Lucia approached him with a menu in hand, her smile firmly in place. "Welcome to Ramirez's Cafe," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "Can I get you something to drink?" The man looked up at her, his eyes the striking blue beneath the shadow of his hood. "Just a coffee, please," he said, his voice soft and slightly accented. "Black." Lucia nodded and hurried off to get his order. As she waited for the coffee to brew, she glanced back at the man. There was something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. But before she could dwell on it, the coffee machine beeped, and she grabbed the mug and carried it over to his table. As she set the mug down, the man looked up at her again. "Thank you," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a small smile. Lucia felt a warmth spread through her chest at the simple gesture of kindness. It was a rare thing in this city, where everyone seemed too busy or too preoccupied to notice the struggles of those around them. As the evening wore on, the cafe began to empty out. Lucia moved between the tables, clearing away dishes and wiping down surfaces. Her feet ached and her back was sore, but she pushed through the pain, knowing that every penny she earned was one step closer to keeping a roof over her head. Mr. Ramirez, the cafe owner, emerged from the back room, his face set in a scowl. He was a large man with a receding hairline and a perpetual air of dissatisfaction. He surveyed the cafe with a critical eye, his gaze settling on Lucia as she worked. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a small smudge on one of the tables. "Honestly, Lucia, I don't know why I keep you around. You're barely worth the minimum wage I pay you." Lucia felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She knew she was a hard worker, knew that she put in more hours than anyone else at the cafe. But nothing she did ever seemed to be good enough for Mr. Ramirez. As she scrubbed at the offending smudge, she heard the bell above the cafe door chime. She looked up to see the hooded man from earlier standing in the doorway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "We're closing up," Mr. Ramirez barked, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "Come back tomorrow." But the man didn't move. Instead, he reached up and pushed back his hood, revealing a face that Lucia recognized instantly. It was Lionel Messi, one of the greatest footballers of all time. Lucia felt her heart skip a beat as she stared at the man before her. She had seen his face countless times on television and in magazines, had watched him weave his magic on the football pitch. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that he would be standing in the middle of Ramirez's cafe, his eyes fixed on her. Mr. Ramirez, for his part, seemed equally stunned. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Messi," he stammered, his earlier rudeness forgotten. "What an honor to have you in my establishment. Please, sit down. Can I get you anything?" But Messi ignored him, his gaze never leaving Lucia's face. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice soft and sincere, "for your kindness earlier. It meant a lot to me." Lucia felt her cheeks flush. "I was just doing my job," she mumbled, suddenly self-conscious under the intensity of his gaze. Messi smiled, a small, gentle curve of his lips. "Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference," he said. "Never underestimate the power of a smile or a kind word." With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Lucia and Mr. Ramirez staring after him in stunned silence. The next day, Lucia arrived at the cafe early, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous evening. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the memory of Lionel Messi's words and the warmth of his smile. As she tied her apron around her waist and began setting up for the day, she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, but instead found herself face to face with Mr. Ramirez. He looked different than he had the night before. His face was drawn and haggard, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles. "Lucia," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "I need to talk to you." Lucia felt a knot of dread form in her stomach. She had seen that look on Mr. Ramirez's face before, and it never boded well. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mr. Ramirez shook his head. "No," he said. "It's not. I'm afraid I have some bad news." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "The cafe is closing down. I can't afford to keep it open anymore." Lucia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The cafe was closing? But what would she do? Where would she go? She had no other job prospects, no savings to fall back on. Without the cafe, she would be homeless and destitute in a matter of days. As the reality of the situation sank in, Lucia felt a wave of panic wash over her. She had worked so hard, had sacrificed so much to keep herself afloat in this unforgiving city. And now, with a few simple words, everything she had fought for was slipping away. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt a flicker of something else deep inside her. A spark of determination, of resilience. She had survived worse than this, had clawed her way out of the depths of poverty and hopelessness before. She would not let this defeat her. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, looking Mr. Ramirez directly in the eye. "I understand," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But I want you to know that I'm not giving up. I'll find a way to make this work." Mr. Ramirez looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. "I admire your spirit, Lucia," he said. "But I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. The cafe is finished." Lucia shook her head. "No," she said. "It's not. We can still save it. We just need to think creatively." Over the next few days, Lucia threw herself into finding a way to save the cafe. She reached out to local businesses, asking if they would be willing to partner with Ramirez's cafe, offering their products in exchange for a share of the profits. She created flyers and social media posts, advertising the cafe's unique charm and cozy atmosphere. And slowly, miraculously, things began to turn around. Customers started coming in, drawn by the promise of locally sourced coffee and fresh, homemade pastries. The cafe began to buzz with energy and life, the once empty tables now filled with people chatting and laughing over steaming mugs of coffee. Mr. Ramirez watched it all with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. He had never seen Lucia so passionate, so driven. She had taken a failing business and turned it into a thriving community hub, all through the sheer force of her will and determination. One evening, as they were closing up the cafe, Mr. Ramirez pulled Lucia aside. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I underestimated you, Lucia. I thought you were just another minimum wage worker, but you've shown me that you're so much more than that. You're a true leader, and I'm proud to have you on my team." Lucia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had worked so hard for so long, had endured so much hardship and struggle. And now, finally, she was being recognized for her efforts. She was making a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of those around her. As the weeks passed, Lucia continued to pour her heart and soul into the cafe. She worked long hours, often staying late into the night to finish up paperwork or prep for the next day. But she didn't mind the extra effort. The cafe had become more than just a job to her. It had become a home, a place where she felt valued and appreciated. But even as the cafe thrived, Lucia couldn't shake the looming threat of eviction. Her landlord had been clear: if she didn't come up with the overdue rent by the end of the month, she would be out on the streets. She had been trying to save every penny she could, cutting back on groceries and skipping meals to make ends meet. But it still wasn't enough. The rent was simply too high, and her wages too low. One evening, as she was locking up the cafe, she heard a soft knock on the door. She turned to see the hooded figure of Lionel Messi standing outside, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Lucia's heart leapt in her chest. She hadn't seen him since that first night, had almost convinced herself that their encounter had been a dream. But here he was, standing before her once again. She opened the door and let him in, trying to keep her voice steady as she greeted him. "Mr. Messi," she said, "what brings you back to Ramirez's cafe?" Messi smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I heard about what you've been doing here," he said. "How you've turned this place around, made it into something special. I wanted to see it for myself." Lucia felt a flush of pride at his words. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "But it's been worth it. This place means everything to me." Messi nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can see that," he said. "You've put your heart and soul into this cafe, Lucia. It shows in every detail." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to her. "I want you to have this," he said. "Consider it a token of my admiration for what you've accomplished here." Lucia took the envelope with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened it slowly, hardly daring to breathe. Inside was a check, made out to her for an amount that made her head spin. She looked up at Messi, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't accept this," she said. "It's too much." But Messi shook his head. "It's not enough," he said. "You deserve so much more, Lucia. You've shown me what true strength and resilience look like. You've given me hope in a world that often feels hopeless." Lucia felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at the check in her hands. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, more than she had ever dreamed of having. With this, she could pay off her rent, could keep a roof over her head and food on her table. She could finally breathe again, could finally stop living in constant fear of losing everything. But even as gratitude and relief washed over her, she knew that this was about more than just the money. It was about the recognition, the validation of all her hard work and sacrifice. It was about knowing that someone believed in her, that someone saw her true worth. She looked up at Messi, her vision blurred with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." Messi smiled, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "You're welcome, Lucia," he said. "But it's you who deserves the thanks. You've reminded me of what really matters in this world. Not fame or fortune, but kindness and compassion, the courage to keep going even when all seems lost." He reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Never forget how strong you are, Lucia," he said. "Never forget the power of your own resilience." The next morning, Lucia arrived at the cafe early, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had paid her rent, had even had enough left over to buy herself a new pair of shoes and a warm coat for the coming winter. But more than that, she felt a new sense of purpose, a renewed dedication to the cafe and the community it served. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, that the road would not always be easy. But she also knew that she had the strength and the resilience to face whatever came her way. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was surprised to see Mr. Ramirez already there, his face drawn and serious. "Lucia," he said, his voice hesitant. "I need to talk to you." Lucia felt a flicker of concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Mr. Ramirez shook his head. "I'm afraid not," he said. "I just got off the phone with the landlord. He's selling the building, and the new owner wants to turn it into luxury apartments. We have to be out by the end of the month." Lucia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The cafe, her home, her everything, gone, just like that. She had fought so hard, had given so much of herself to this place. And now it was all for nothing. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Lucia felt a flicker of something else deep inside her. A spark of determination, of hope. She had come too far to give up now, had fought too hard to let this defeat her. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, looking Mr. Ramirez directly in the eye. "We're not going down without a fight," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We've built something special here, something that matters to this community. We can't just let it slip away." Mr. Ramirez looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. "What do you propose we do?" he asked. Lucia thought for a moment, her mind racing. "We rally the troops," she said. "We reach out to our customers, our partners, anyone who has ever believed in what we're doing here. We show them what this place means to us, and we ask for their help." Over the next few weeks, Lucia and Mr. Ramirez worked tirelessly to save the cafe. They organized fundraisers and events, and reached out to local media outlets to spread the word about their plight. And slowly, miraculously, the community began to respond. Customers came in droves, donating money and time to help keep the cafe afloat. Local businesses offered their support, providing supplies and services at a discount. Even the landlord, moved by the outpouring of love and support, agreed to give them more time to find a new location. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a miracle happened. Lionel Messi, the man who had started it all, the man who had believed in Lucia from the very beginning, stepped forward with an offer that left them all speechless. He had bought a building, he said, a beautiful old brick storefront just a few blocks away. And he wanted to give it to them, to Ramirez's cafe, to Lucia and Mr. Ramirez and all the people who had fought so hard to keep their dream alive. Lucia felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at Messi, her heart overflowing with gratitude and disbelief. "Why," she whispered. "Why would you do this for us?" Messi smiled, his eyes warm and kind. "Because you believed in yourself," he said. "Because you never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against you. Because you showed me what true strength and resilience look like." He reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "This is your dream, Lucia," he said. "Your vision. And I want to help you make it a reality." The day of the grand reopening was a day Lucia would never forget. The sun shone bright and clear, casting a golden glow over the bustling streets. The air was alive with excitement and anticipation, the sidewalks crowded with people eager to see the new and improved Ramirez's cafe. As Lucia stood behind the counter, her apron freshly pressed and her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, she felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that she had never known before. She had done it. She had saved the cafe, had created something beautiful and meaningful out of nothing but her own determination and hard work. And as she looked out at the sea of smiling faces, at the customers and friends and neighbors who had stood by her through it all, she knew that this was about more than just a cafe. It was about community, about connection, about the power of small acts of kindness to change the world. She caught Messi's eye from across the room, saw the pride and admiration shining in his gaze. And she knew, in that moment, that anything was possible. That with courage and compassion, with resilience and hope, there was no obstacle too great to overcome, no dream too big to achieve. As the first customer stepped up to the counter, Lucia took a deep breath and smiled, ready to begin this new chapter in her life. Ready to keep fighting, keep believing, keep dreaming. ready to make her mark on the world, one cup of coffee at a time.